The leather cracked against Celia's wrist as Lucius Moorhavenford yanked it from his waist. This wasn't punishment, it was prelude. This is the story of how one woman's desperate act of self-defense would challenge the very foundations of American slavery and ignite a legal firestorm that newspapers from New York to New Orleans couldn't ignore. The year was 1855, and the air in the Moorhavenford estate outside St. Louis hung thick with Missouri summer heat. Cicadas screamed their warnings from the oak trees, while inside the manor house, floorboards groaned under the weight of footsteps that had walked the same predatory path for 5 long years. The scent of tobacco and whiskey clung to the wallpaper like a stain that wouldn't wash clean. Celia had been 14 when Moorhavenford first bought her at the slave market in downtown St. Louis. Now 19, she moved through the house with the careful grace of someone who had learned to read danger in the shift of shadows, the creak of a door, the particular way her master's breathing changed when he'd been drinking. Her calloused hands told the story of cotton fields and kitchen fires, but her eyes held something else entirely. A flicker of intelligence that Moorhavenford had tried repeatedly to extinguish. The peculiar institution, as politicians called it, had rules. Masters owned their slaves' bodies, their labor, their children, their very breath. But on this sweltering August night, as Moorhavenford's belt slithered through its loops like a snake preparing to strike, those rules were about to shatter. The manor house sat on 200 acres of prime Missouri farmland, its white columns gleaming in the moonlight like tombstones marking the graves of human dignity. Inside, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, each note hanging in the air like a countdown. Celia stood in the master bedroom, her cotton dress already torn at the shoulder from an earlier struggle, her bare feet planted on Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual wages. Moorhavenford was not a large man, 5 feet 8 inches of wiry muscle and bourbon-fueled entitlement, but size had never mattered in this particular dynamic. The law was on his side. The church was on his side. Even God, according to the preachers who blessed slave auctions, was on his side. "You know why you're here," he said, coiling the belt around his fist. The brass buckle caught the lamplight like a warning, but something had changed in Celia during the long, brutal months of summer. Perhaps it was the whispered conversations she'd overheard between visiting abolitionists and Moorhavenford's more liberal neighbors. Perhaps it was the letter she'd glimpsed on his desk correspondence about selling her south to the sugar plantations, where life expectancy rarely exceeded 7 years. Or perhaps it was simply that a human soul, no matter how systematically brutalized, eventually reaches a point where death becomes preferable to submission. The belt hung loose in his grip now, 3 feet of seasoned leather that had already served as both symbol and instrument of his absolute power over her body. What happens when an entire legal system is built on the premise that some people aren't people at all? As Moorhavenford moved toward her with that familiar predatory gait, Celia's fingers found the edge of the wash basin. The same hands that had picked cotton since dawn were about to write a new chapter in the long, bloody history of resistance. Before we dive deeper into how one desperate moment would expose the moral bankruptcy of an entire nation, let me ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. This story belongs to all of us, no matter where we are in the world. And if this kind of deep historical storytelling speaks to you, hit that like button and subscribe, because the cases we cover only get more complex from here. The brass buckle hit the floor with a metallic thud that would echo in legal precedent for decades. Moorhavenford's belt lay coiled like a dead snake beside his body. This moment would force America's legal system to confront an impossible question. Could property commit murder against its owner? The wash basin had shattered when Celia swung it, porcelain fragments scattered across the hardwood like broken teeth. But it was the belt, his own instrument of torment, that had done the killing. In the suffocating darkness of that August night, with only a single oil lamp casting dancing shadows across the bedroom walls. Celia had grabbed the leather strap as Moorhavenford stumbled backward from her desperate blow. What happened next lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it would reverberate through courtrooms and newspaper editorials for months to come. The clock downstairs had just finished chiming 11:30 when silence finally returned to the Moorhavenford estate. Outside, tree frogs sang their night chorus, oblivious to the fact that inside the manor house, the established order of Missouri society had just been strangled with 3 feet of tanned cowhide. Celia stood over the body, her chest heaving, blood from the broken porcelain trickling down her forearm. Moonlight streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating a scene that would have been unthinkable to most white Missourians. A slave woman standing triumphant over her dead master. But triumph was the wrong word. This wasn't victory. It was survival instinct, finally overwhelming years of systematic brutalization. The legal implications were staggering. Under Missouri's slave code, enacted in 1847, slaves were classified as chattel property, with no more legal standing than livestock. They couldn't own property, couldn't testify against white people in court, couldn't even legally defend themselves against assault. Yet here was Celia, having committed what the law would undoubtedly classify as murder, the destruction of valuable property by the property itself. A newspaper editor in nearby Jefferson City would later write, "The peculiar circumstances of this case present our legal system with a paradox that strikes at the very heart of the slavery question." Death had its own logic now, but Celia's mind was already working beyond the immediate horror. She knew the discovery of Moorhavenford's body would trigger a manhunt that would make the Underground Railroad look like a Sunday school picnic. Bloodhounds, bounty hunters, federal marshals, every resource of the state would be mobilized to bring her back for public execution. The message had to be clear. Slaves who killed their masters faced consequences so severe that even the thought would die in other minds before it could take root. The body was heavy, 145 pounds of dead weight that had to be moved before dawn. Celia wrapped Moorhavenford in the bedsheets, her movements methodical despite the trembling in her hands. She'd learned patience from 5 years of cotton picking, learned to work through pain and exhaustion when quitting meant the whip. Now those same survival skills would serve a different purpose. By 2 a.m, she had dragged the corpse through the kitchen and out the back door. The vegetable garden behind the house provided loose earth and the cover of tall corn stalks. As she dug by lamplight, sweat mixing with tears on her face, Celia couldn't have known she was creating what would become one of the most controversial crime scenes in antebellum America. The deeper she dug, the more she understood there was no going back. Even if she managed to hide the body perfectly, Moorhavenford's absence would be noticed within days. His business partner, Basil Ravenscroft, was scheduled to arrive from St. Louis on Thursday to discuss a cotton futures contract. The neighboring plantation owner, Theophilus Ashbournford, borrowed tools with suspicious frequency. Questions would be asked. Searches would be conducted. But Celia had one advantage that Moorhavenford's legal system had never anticipated. She was invisible. 5 years of being treated as human furniture had taught her to move through white society without being truly seen. While other slaves were conspicuous in their bondage, Celia had learned to blend into the background of daily life, the perfect camouflage for someone planning to disappear entirely. As she finished covering the grave with corn husks and garden soil, the eastern horizon was already beginning to lighten. Dawn meant discovery was possible. It also meant the beginning of the most audacious escape attempt in Missouri history. How do you hide from an entire state when every law enforcement officer, every bounty hunter, and every citizen with eyes is looking for you? Tomorrow, Celia would walk into St. Point, Louis, as a free woman, carrying forged papers and wearing stolen clothes, betting her life on the one thing the legal system refused to acknowledge, that she was human enough to think, plan, and disappear into plain sight. Steam whistles shrieked across the Mississippi as the morning packet boats prepared to dock. Celia stepped off the farmer's wagon into the chaos of St. Louis, wearing a dead woman's dress and carrying papers that claimed she belonged to no one. This was 1855 Missouri, where a single suspicious glance could mean the difference between freedom and the gallows. And Celia was about to prove that the most dangerous place to hide might be in plain sight. The gateway city assaulted her senses like a physical blow. Horse hooves clattered against cobblestones slick with morning dew, while the acrid smell of coal smoke from a dozen steamboat stacks mixed with the sweet rot of overripe fruit from the riverside markets. Her fingers gripped the handle of a worn carpet bag, everything she owned in the world, stolen from Moorhavenford's house the night she killed him. The rough wool of her borrowed dress scratched against skin, still tender from years of cotton-picking scars. Celia had studied St. Louis from afar during her years of bondage, listening to conversations between Moorhavenford and his business associates. She knew the city housed nearly 4,000 free blacks alongside its slave population, enough to provide camouflage for someone willing to take extraordinary risks. The forged manumission papers folded in her bodice claimed she was Delia Freeman, freed by the will of a fictitious Charleston master. The document was crude by legal standards, but most white Missourians barely glanced at such papers. Free blacks were expected to carry proof of their status, but the assumption was that no slave would dare forge freedom papers. The penalty for being caught was immediate sale to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana. By 10 in the morning, she had found lodging in a boarding house on Lucas Place, run by a free black woman named Viola Washington, who asked few questions and accepted payment in advance. The room was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single window overlooking an alley where pigs rooted through kitchen scraps, but it was hers. For the first time in her 19 years of life, Celia controlled a door that locked from the inside. The transformation was methodical. She cropped her hair short and covered it with a white kerchief, in the style of working free women. She practiced walking with the confident stride of someone who had never felt the bite of a master's whip. Most crucially, she memorized the intricate social codes that separated free blacks from slaves in Missouri society. Free blacks could earn wages, own property in limited circumstances, and move about the city without passes, privileges that required constant proof and vigilant performance. A reporter for the Missouri Republican would later write, "The ease with which this Negro woman moved through civilized society demonstrates the porous nature of our racial boundaries and the dangerous precedent of slaves who can pass for free." Freedom was just another performance. Her first job came within a week, washing laundry for a German immigrant family who paid 50 cents a day and never asked about her past. The Heinrichs lived in a brick house near the cathedral, and Frau Heinrich spoke broken English with an accent thick enough to make communication about anything beyond soap and starch nearly impossible. This linguistic barrier became Celia's protection. Complex questions about her origins were impossible to ask and even harder to answer. But survival in St. Louis required more than just employment. The city's free black community was tightly knit, bound together by mutual protection and shared vulnerability. Everyone knew everyone's business, and newcomers were scrutinized with the careful attention of people whose lives depended on identifying potential threats. Celia attended services at the African Methodist Episcopal Church on 5th Street, where she listened more than she spoke and learned the rhythms of free black respectability. She contributed small coins to the church poor box and volunteered to help with literacy classes for newly freed slaves' activities that established her bona fides as a legitimate member of the community. The most dangerous moments came when she encountered other slaves on errands for their masters. Something in their eyes' recognition, perhaps, or the shared understanding of what bondage actually meant, threatened to expose her carefully constructed facade. Twice, slaves from outlying plantations stared at her with suspicious intensity during market days. Both times, she managed to disappear into crowds before questions could be asked. By October, 3 months after Moorhavenford's murder, Celia had achieved something unprecedented in Missouri history. She was a fugitive slave living openly in the state's largest city, earning wages, attending church, and participating in a community that believed she belonged there. The grave behind the Moorhavenford estate had remained undisturbed, covered by autumn leaves, and the general assumption that the master had traveled east on business. But the most carefully constructed lies eventually collide with inconvenient truths. And Celia's truth was about to catch up with her in the form of someone who knew exactly who she really was. How long can you outrun your own shadow when everyone around you is searching for someone who looks exactly like you? The letter that would destroy everything was already making its way through the postal system, written by a plantation overseer whose memory was longer than Celia's new identity was strong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with wax that bore the imprint of a plantation signet ring. Inside, 27 words would shatter the most audacious escape in Missouri history. This was the moment when Celia would learn that, in a society built on human bondage, trust was a luxury that slaves, even escaped ones, could never afford. The St. Louis post office on Market Street buzzed with the usual morning activity. Mail clerks sorted correspondence, while the smell of ink and paper dust hung thick in the air. Hadrian Coldenhurst, the city's chief postal inspector, ran his fingers across envelope after envelope with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years moving other people's secrets through the federal mail system. The letter that would destroy Celia bore the return address of Fenwick Plantation, located 40 miles southeast of the city. Inside the envelope, written in the careful script of an overseer who had learned his letters late in life, was a message addressed to the St. Louis Municipal Slave Patrol. Gentlemen, the Negro woman calling herself Delia Freeman, residing on Lucas Place, is in fact the escaped slave Celia, property of the late Lucius Moorhavenford. She is wanted for questioning regarding her master's disappearance. Your servant, D. Blackwood, Overseer. The letter had been written by a man named Darius Fenwickley, though he signed it with a false name for his own protection. Fenwickley had recognized Celia during a chance encounter at the Riverside Market 3 weeks earlier. He had worked as a temporary overseer on the Moorhavenford estate during cotton season in 1854, and Celia's face was burned into his memory for reasons that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with his own frustrated desires. Recognition had been instantaneous and mutual. Celia had been purchasing soap from a German merchant when she felt eyes boring into her back with predatory intensity. She turned and found Fenwickley staring at her from across the crowded marketplace, his thin lips curved in a smile that promised nothing but trouble. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, they faced each other across 20 feet of busy commerce, the escaped slave and the man who could destroy her with a single word. Celia had run, not conspicuously, but with the controlled urgency of someone whose survival instincts had been honed by years of reading danger in men's expressions. She melted into the crowd of shoppers and disappeared down a side street. But the damage was done. Fenwickley knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, he knew she was worth money. The bounty system was brutal in its simplicity. Under Missouri law, anyone who captured and returned a fugitive slave received a reward equal to 10% of the slave's assessed value, plus expenses. Moorhavenford had paid $800 for Celia in 1850, making her worth at least $1,000 by current market rates. Fenwickley stood to earn $100 for a single letter, more than most working men made in 6 months. But Fenwickley was also smart enough to understand that a premature accusation could backfire. If Celia somehow proved her free status through legitimate documentation, he could face charges for false imprisonment. So he waited, watched, and gathered intelligence. Over the course of 3 weeks, he stalked her through St. Louis like a hunter tracking wounded prey. The investigation was methodical. Fenwickly discovered where she lived, where she worked, which church she attended. He learned that her supposed manumission papers came from South Carolina, a state he had never visited, but knew enough about to spot inconsistencies. Most damning of all, he confirmed, through discreet inquiries, that no Charleston master named Benjamin Freeman had ever filed manumission papers for a slave named Delia. On November 15, 1855, the St. Louis Municipal Slave Patrol received Fenwickly's letter. By noon, officers were surrounding the boarding house on Lucas Place. Celia was folding laundry in her rented room when she heard boots on the stairs. Heavy, purposeful steps that belonged to men who weren't coming to collect, rent, or deliver messages. She moved to the window and saw what she had dreaded for months: uniformed officers with badges glinting in the afternoon sun, their hands resting on the clubs that hung from their belts. The knock on her door was polite but firm. "Miss Freeman? St. Louis Municipal Patrol. We'd like to speak with you about your documentation." Through the thin wood, Celia could hear at least 3 different voices. She knew that opening the door meant the end of everything she had built during her months of freedom. But she also knew that barricading herself inside would only confirm their suspicions and make her eventual capture more violent. She opened the door with steady hands and looked into the faces of 3 white men who had already decided her fate. "Your papers, miss," said the sergeant, though his tone suggested the courtesy was purely procedural. Celia handed over the forged manumission documents that had protected her for 4 months. The sergeant examined them with the careful attention of someone who had seen hundreds of similar documents and knew exactly what to look for. After 30 seconds, he looked up with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something approaching pity. "These papers are forgeries," he said simply, "and we have reason to believe you are the escaped slave Celia, property of the Moorhavenford estate." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around them, the boarding house had gone silent, other tenants pressing their ears to doors and walls, understanding that they were witnessing either justice or tragedy, depending on your perspective on what it meant to own another human being. What do you do when the law itself is your enemy, and every authority figure represents a threat to your very existence? As the shackles closed around her wrists with a metallic click that seemed to echo through the entire city, Celia understood that her trial would be about far more than one slave killing one master. It would be about whether the legal system could acknowledge her humanity without destroying itself in the process. The courthouse steps in. St. Louis were slick with November rain as 12 white men filed inside to decide whether property could murder its owner. The gavel that would seal Celia's fate rested on a mahogany bench imported from Virginia, a state that had built its wealth on the backs of people like her. This trial would expose the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American slavery. How do you prosecute someone the law refuses to recognize as human? The St. Louis County Courthouse reeked of tobacco juice and wet wool, while the rhythmic scratch of court reporters' pens provided a steady counterpoint to the whispered conversations that filled the gallery. Outside, November wind rattled windows that had witnessed hundreds of slave auctions, property disputes, and runaway hearings, but never anything like this. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of spectators who had come to witness what newspapers were already calling the most peculiar case in Missouri jurisprudence. Judge Cedric Bramblemore presided from behind a bench that towered 8 feet above the courtroom floor, his white whiskers precisely trimmed and his black robes pressed to military perfection. Bramblemore had spent 23 years interpreting Missouri law, and in all that time he had never encountered a legal puzzle quite like the one sitting in shackles before him. Under state statute, slaves possessed no legal standing to defend themselves against any charges. They couldn't testify on their own behalf, couldn't hire attorneys, and couldn't appeal convictions. Yet here was Celia, charged with first-degree murder, a crime that presupposed the defendant was human enough to form criminal intent. The prosecution case was led by District Attorney Basil Ravenswortham, a thin man whose voice carried the authority of someone who had never lost a case involving enslaved defendants. His opening statement was precise and devastating. Gentlemen of the jury, the facts are simple. The defendant, a piece of property belonging to Lucius Moorhavenford, destroyed her lawful owner through premeditated violence. The law is equally simple. Property that destroys property must be disposed of to protect the interests of all property owners in this state. But the legal complications began immediately. Celia's court-appointed defender, a reluctant attorney named Edmund Blackfieldson, who had drawn the assignment through an unlucky lottery system, raised an objection that would echo through legal scholars for decades. Your Honor, if the defendant is property, as the prosecution claims, then she cannot be held criminally responsible for her actions any more than a horse that kicks its owner or a dog that bites. Criminal law presupposes moral agency, which presupposes humanity. The courtroom fell silent. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Judge Bramblemore adjusted his spectacles and spent nearly 5 minutes reviewing statute books before responding. The court will allow the trial to proceed under existing murder statutes, with the understanding that this case presents novel questions that may require careful consideration. Justice had no precedent for this. The evidence phase began with the discovery of Moorhavenford's body. 3 weeks after Celia's arrest, investigators had finally located the makeshift grave behind the estate house. What they found was a corpse wrapped in bed linens, with clear evidence of strangulation around the neck. The murder weapon, Moorhavenford's own belt, was buried alongside the body, still bearing traces of soil and decomposition. Theophilus Ashbourneford, the neighboring plantation owner who had first reported Moorhavenford's absence, testified about the victim's character with the careful language of someone who knew uncomfortable truths. Lucius was a man of strong appetites. He managed his property with firm discipline, as was his right under law. But the prosecution's star witness was Darius Fenwickley, the overseer who had recognized Celia in St. Louis and triggered her capture. Fenwickley took the stand wearing his best suit, and the expression of a man who understood his testimony was worth a $100 bounty. His account was damning in its detail. He had worked on the Moorhavenford estate during cotton season and could testify that Celia had shown signs of rebellious character and insufficient submission to proper authority. Under cross-examination, however, Fenwickley's motivations became clearer. Attorney Blackfieldson pressed him about his financial interest in Celia's capture and his own relationship with enslaved women on various plantations. The questioning revealed a pattern of behavior that made even the all-white jury shift uncomfortably in their seats. Is it not true, Mr. Fenwickley, that you have a personal interest in seeing female slaves punished when they resist unwanted attention? Objection, shouted Prosecutor Ravenswortham. The witness's personal conduct is irrelevant to the facts of this murder case. Sustained, ruled Judge Bramblemore, though his tone suggested the question had struck a nerve. The most dramatic moment came when the defense attempted to introduce evidence about Moorhavenford's treatment of Celia. Blackfieldson argued that any violence on her part constituted self-defense against sexual assault, a legal theory that would require the court to acknowledge that enslaved women possessed bodily autonomy worth defending. The prosecution's response was swift and brutal. Your Honor, the defense is asking this court to recognize rights that do not exist under Missouri law. A slave cannot be assaulted by her owner any more than a plow can be assaulted by a farmer. To accept this argument would undermine the entire legal foundation of property rights in this state. The jury of 12 white men, farmers, merchants, and tradesmen, who owned a combined total of 47 enslaved people, deliberated for exactly 37 minutes. Their verdict was inevitable from the moment Celia was shackled, but the speed of their decision shocked even hardened court observers. Guilty of murder in the first degree, Judge Bramblemore scheduled sentencing for the following Monday. leaving Celia to spend her final weekend in a cell that measured 6 feet by 8 feet and smelled of human despair. But the case had already escaped the confines of Missouri law. Newspaper editors from New York to Charleston were asking the same dangerous question that Edmund Blackfieldson had raised in his opening statement. If slaves were property, how could they commit crimes? And if they could commit crimes, how could they be property? The answer would come down to 12 men who had to choose between preserving a legal system built on human bondage and acknowledging a truth that threatened to destroy everything they thought they knew about justice, morality, and the value of a human life. The ink was still wet on the verdict when telegraph operators began tapping out messages that would carry Celia's story across a nation already fracturing along the fault lines of slavery. Each dot and dash, transmitted through copper wires, represented a crack in the foundation of American moral certainty. This was the moment when a single slave woman's act of desperation would become ammunition in a propaganda war that was already tearing the country apart, and neither side would let her story remain simple. The Missouri Republicans' printing presses rolled through the night of November 28, 1855, their mechanical rhythm echoing through the streets of St. Louis like a heartbeat counting down to war. The newspaper's editorial office reeked of ink and hot metal, while compositors worked by lamplight to set type for what would become one of the most widely reprinted stories of the decade. Editor Septimus Coldenwellford had recognized immediately that Celia's case represented something far more dangerous than a simple murder trial. It was a legal paradox that exposed the intellectual bankruptcy of the entire slavery system. The Republicans' coverage was measured but devastating. The conviction of the Negro woman Celia for the murder of her master presents our courts with a precedent that may well haunt future jurisprudence. If slaves possess sufficient moral agency to commit premeditated murder, by what logic do we deny them the basic human rights that accompany such agency? But the story's real power came from how it traveled. Within a week, newspapers from Boston to Savannah were reprinting excerpts from the trial transcripts, each publication shaping the narrative to serve their own political agenda. The process was like watching a single pebble create ripples that eventually became tsunamis. Northern abolitionists seized on Celia's story as proof that slavery corrupted both master and slave, creating conditions where violence became inevitable. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator ran a front-page editorial titled "The Fruits of Human Bondage," arguing that when men treat women as property, they create the very monsters they claim to fear. The piece included graphic descriptions of Moorhavenford's treatment of Celia, details that had been excluded from the trial, but reconstructed through interviews with other slaves who had escaped the estate. Southern newspapers responded with equally passionate but opposite interpretations. The Charleston Mercury dismissed Celia as a murderous savage whose crime demonstrates the necessity of firm discipline in managing Negro property. Their coverage focused relentlessly on the threat that slave rebellions posed to white families, warning that lenient treatment of this killer will encourage similar atrocities throughout the slaveholding states. The propaganda war was total. Most revealing were the newspapers that tried to find middle ground. The Louisville Journal, published in the border state of Kentucky, ran an editorial that captured the legal confusion perfectly. We find ourselves in the peculiar position of condemning a crime committed by someone our laws refuse to recognize as capable of committing crimes. The contradiction is so profound that it calls into question the very foundations of our legal system. Meanwhile, in her St. Louis jail cell, Celia remained largely unaware of the national debate swirling around her name. The cell measured 6 feet by 8 feet, with walls of limestone that wept moisture in the November cold. She was allowed visitors on Wednesdays, mostly members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who brought food and whispered prayers. But even these brief human contacts were monitored by guards who reported conversations to District Attorney Ravenswortham. The most unexpected visitor came on December 5th. Dr. Harriet Mills, a white woman and secret abolitionist who ran a boarding school for young ladies, arrived with a basket of soap and clean clothing. Dr. Harriet Mills. Mills had connections to the Underground Railroad and had initially planned to help Celia escape during transport to the execution site. But after studying the case transcripts, she realized that Celia's death might serve the abolitionist cause more effectively than her rescue. The conversation that followed would haunt Dr. Mills for the rest of her life. Speaking in whispers that barely carried beyond the cell bars, she explained to Celia how her story was being used by people across the country, some to argue for abolition, others to justify even harsher controls on enslaved people. "Do you understand," Dr. Mills asked, "that your death may save more lives than your life ever could?" Celia's response was recorded in Dr. Mills's private diary, discovered decades later. "I understand that white folks will use my bones to build whatever they want to build. I just pray that something good grows from the grave they're digging for me." The execution was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 2 weeks before Christmas. Judge Bramblemore had chosen the date deliberately, believing that the holiday season would minimize public attention and prevent Celia's death from becoming a rallying point for abolitionists. But newspaper editors had other plans. The real power of Celia's story wasn't in the legal precedent or the political symbolism. It was in how it forced ordinary Americans to confront an uncomfortable question about their own moral complicity in a system built on human bondage. How many people were willing to acknowledge that their comfortable lives depended on the systematic brutalization of people like Celia? As December 15th approached, telegraph lines buzzed with messages from editors, politicians, and activists who understood that a 19-year-old woman's execution would become a defining moment in the national conversation about slavery, regardless of whether she lived or died. The gallows rose against the December sky like a wooden altar to white supremacy. 300 spectators gathered in the courthouse square, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air as they waited to witness justice or vengeance served. This execution would prove that in 1855 America, the law cared less about right and wrong than about preserving a system that treated human beings like livestock. The scaffold had been constructed in 4 hours by a team of carpenters who worked with grim efficiency, their hammers ringing against fresh pine boards that still bled sap in the winter cold. The smell of sawdust mixed with the acrid smoke from dozens of tobacco pipes, while the rhythmic scrape of boots on frozen cobblestones provided a funeral march for a woman whose crime was refusing to die quietly. Judge Bramblemore had chosen the courthouse square, deliberately the same location where slave auctions were held every Tuesday and Friday, where human beings were bought and sold like furniture or farm equipment. Celia emerged from the jailhouse at 11:47 in the morning, flanked by 4 guards whose faces showed no emotion beyond professional duty. She wore the same cotton dress she had been arrested in, now washed and mended by the churchwomen who had visited her cell. Her hands were bound with rope instead of shackles, a small mercy that Judge Bramblemore had granted after pressure from several prominent St. Louis ministers who argued that unnecessary brutality would reflect poorly on Christian civilization. The crowd parted as she walked the 100 yards from jail to scaffold, creating a human corridor lined with faces that ranged from curious to hostile to secretly sympathetic. Near the front stood several other enslaved people, brought by their masters to witness what happened to slaves who forgot their place. Their eyes met Celia's for brief moments, exchanges that carried more communication than any words could convey. But the most revealing faces belonged to the white spectators who had come to ensure that justice was served. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, wife of a prominent cotton merchant, held a lace handkerchief to her nose as if Celia's proximity might contaminate the air. Banker Harrison Wells adjusted his gold watch chain and muttered to his companion about the importance of maintaining proper discipline among the Negro population. Even the children present, boys and girls who should have been in school, stared with the fascination of people watching a public execution as entertainment. Death was a public performance. The execution protocol was precise, developed through decades of hanging runaway slaves and rebellious field hands. Reverend Samuel Morrison, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church, offered a final prayer that focused more on the sanctity of property rights than on mercy for the condemned. His words carried across the square with practiced authority. Lord, we ask that this woman's death serve as a reminder that all authority comes from you, and that resistance to lawful authority is resistance to the divine order you have established. Celia was allowed to speak final words, a tradition that usually provided opportunities for enslaved people to express repentance and warn other slaves against similar rebellion. But her statement, recorded by 3 different newspaper reporters, was not what anyone expected. I killed a man who treated me like an animal. If that makes me a murderer, then your laws have made murderers of everyone who values their own humanity above someone else's property rights. The crowd stirred uneasily. Several spectators shouted for her to be silenced, but Judge Bramblemore allowed her to continue. I am not sorry for defending myself. I am only sorry that I was born into a world where such defense was necessary. The executioner, a professional hangman imported from Jefferson City named Thomas Grimsby, had performed this duty 17 times before. His technique was efficient, a calculated drop designed to break the neck cleanly rather than allow strangulation. But as he placed the noose around Celia's neck, something unprecedented happened. Dr. Mills, the abolitionist schoolteacher who had visited Celia in her cell, stepped forward from the crowd, carrying a legal document. Her voice cut through the December air with surprising authority. Stop! I have an injunction from the Federal Circuit Court. The paper she waved bore official seals and signatures, claiming that Celia's case raised constitutional questions that required federal review. The legal argument was complex, that Missouri's slave codes violated the Fifth Amendment's guarantee that no person could be deprived of life without due process of law. If Celia was property, she couldn't be executed for crimes. If she was a person, she deserved constitutional protections. Judge Bramblemore examined the document with growing irritation. The injunction was technically valid, filed just minutes before the execution through legal channels that Dr. Mills had spent weeks establishing. But the deeper problem was, political federal intervention in state slavery matters was exactly the kind of constitutional crisis that politicians had been trying to avoid. The crowd began to murmur restlessly. Some demanded that the execution proceed regardless of federal interference. Others, sensing the legal complications, started to drift away from what was becoming a political spectacle rather than simple frontier justice. What happens when the law itself becomes the criminal? As telegraph operators prepared to send news of the delayed execution across the country, Celia remained on the scaffold with the noose around her neck suspended between life and death by legal technicalities that would ultimately determine whether America could continue pretending that slavery was compatible with constitutional government. The federal injunction lasted exactly 18 days before political pressure crushed it like a spider under a boot heel. On January 2nd, 1856, Celia walked to the gallows for the second time, but this execution would create a ghost that would haunt America for generations. This was the moment when one woman's death would prove that some stories are too powerful to be silenced by rope and law, and that resistance, once planted in the public mind, grows stronger in the soil of martyrdom. The second scaffold was built in the same courthouse square, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Word of the federal intervention had spread through abolitionist networks like wildfire, transforming Celia from a local criminal into a national symbol. The crowd was smaller this time, only about 150 spectators, but the tension was electric. Federal marshals stood at every corner, their presence a reminder that this execution was happening under the watchful eye of a government already fracturing along sectional lines. Dr. Mills had exhausted every legal avenue during the 18-day delay, Her federal injunction had been overturned by the Supreme Court in a terse, 3-paragraph decision that essentially ruled that constitutional protections did not extend to enslaved people, regardless of the circumstances. The decision would be cited in legal textbooks for the next century as one of the clearest examples of how law could be used to protect institutional evil. Celia emerged from the jailhouse wearing a new dress, white cotton with blue trim, sewn by the churchwomen who had adopted her as a symbol of suffering innocence. Her demeanor was different from 18 days earlier. The brief taste of hope had been replaced by something harder, a calm acceptance that her death would speak louder than her life ever could. This time, there were no last-minute interventions. Reverend Morrison offered the same formulaic prayer about divine authority and proper submission. Judge Bramblemore read the death warrant with bureaucratic precision. Thomas Grimsby, the hangman, performed his duties with the same professional efficiency he had demonstrated dozens of times before. But something had changed in those 18 days. Newspaper correspondents from 7 different states were present, their pencils scratching furiously as they recorded every detail. The execution that Missouri authorities had hoped would serve as a quiet warning to other slaves had become a national news event. Death became front-page news. Celia's final words were brief but devastating. "They are killing me for refusing to be property. Remember that when you decide what kind of country you want to be." The drop came at 11:53 a.m. Medical examination confirmed death at 12:07 p.m. The body was released to the African Methodist Episcopal Church for burial in an unmarked grave behind their building on 5th Street. But death was just the beginning of Celia's real impact. Within hours, telegraph lines were carrying news of the execution across the country. The New York Tribune ran a front-page story titled, "Missouri Hangs Woman for Defending Her Honor." The Charleston Mercury responded with an editorial praising swift justice for Negro criminality. Frederick Douglass wrote a piece for his newspaper that concluded, "Celia died as she lived free in spirit, if not in law." The most powerful response came from Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin had already inflamed national tensions over slavery. Stowe's essay about Celia, published in the Atlantic Monthly, reached an audience of nearly 50,000 readers. When law becomes the enemy of justice, resistance becomes the highest form of patriotism. Celia understood this truth in ways that our politicians refuse to acknowledge. By the spring of 1856, Remember Celia had become a rallying cry for abolitionists across the North. Her story was retold in churches, printed on handbills, and referenced in congressional speeches. The woman who had died as nameless property had been reborn as an icon of resistance, whose influence would ripple through the final years before Civil War. The legal precedent established by her case, that slaves could be executed for crimes while being denied the legal protections that accompany criminal responsibility, became one of the most frequently cited examples of slavery's fundamental contradictions. Law professors would assign her case to students for the next century, asking them to explain how a legal system could simultaneously deny someone's humanity while holding them accountable for human actions. But perhaps the most telling response came from the slave-owning class itself. Private letters discovered in plantation archives reveal that Celia's execution triggered a wave of paranoia among masters who suddenly saw potential rebellion in every enslaved face. The very brutality designed to prevent resistance had created a symbol that made resistance seem both inevitable and justified. How do you kill an idea once it has been written in blood and remembered in song? The unmarked grave behind the African Methodist Episcopal Church became an unofficial pilgrimage site for both free and enslaved African Americans, traveling through St. Louis, a place where people left flowers, whispered prayers, and promised to carry forward the memory of a woman who chose death over submission. Even today, some say that on cold January nights in St. Louis, You can still hear the echo of defiant last words carried on the wind, reminding anyone who listens that true freedom cannot be legislated away or executed out of existence. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.